Tech founder vanished after firing his team. Hours later, his Tesla drove itself into the mountains. Marcus Valera had always believed that control was an illusion, a comforting lie people told themselves to sleep better at night. But on a cold Tuesday morning in late March, as he sat in the glass-walled conference room of his Palo Alto office, he realized he was about to shatter that illusion for 16 people who trusted him. The sun hadn't fully risen yet. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the parking lot was still dark, except for the occasional glow of headlights as early employees arrived. Marcus watched them park, watched them check their phones, watched them walk toward the building with their shoulders hunched against the morning chill. He knew what was coming. They didn't. At 34 years old, Marcus had built Sentinel AI from nothing. It was supposed to be the future of predictive analytics, a platform that could anticipate market crashes, cyber threats, and supply chain failures before they happened. Investors loved the pitch. The technology worked mostly, but the money had run out faster than anyone expected, and the latest funding round had collapsed 3 weeks earlier when their lead investor pulled out without explanation. Before we go further, I want to take a moment to thank you for being here. Stories like this one, stories about ambition, trust, and the things we can't predict, need people willing to listen. If you're finding this compelling, please consider subscribing. It helps us tell more stories that matter, and it means the world to have you as part of this community. Marcus had spent the last 72 hours trying to find a way out. He'd called everyone he knew. He'd restructured the cap table a dozen different ways on spreadsheets that glowed in his apartment at 3 in the morning. Nothing worked. The math was brutal and simple. Sentinel AI was out of runway, and without a team, he might be able to stretch the remaining cash long enough to find a buyer, maybe even pivot into something smaller. With a full team, they'd be bankrupt in 3 weeks. His co-founder, Priya Mehta, had left the company 6 months earlier, after a bitter argument about the direction of the product. She'd seen the writing on the wall before Marcus had. "You're building something nobody actually needs," she told him on her last day. "You're building it because it's cool, not because it solves a real problem." He dismissed her then. Now, sitting alone in the conference room, her words echoed in his head like a prophecy he'd refused to hear. The HR consultant arrived at 7:30. Her name was Angela, and she'd done this 100 times before. She was professional, calm, almost clinical in the way she walked Marcus through the process. "Keep it short," she advised. "Don't over-explain. Don't make promises you can't keep. Give them the severance information, offer the outplacement services, and let them process it on their own time." She made it sound like surgery, like something antiseptic and necessary. The meeting started at 8. Marcus had decided to do them one-on-one rather than in a group. It felt more humane, though he knew it was just another lie he was telling himself. Each conversation lasted about 10 minutes. He watched as confusion turned to disbelief, disbelief turned to anger, and anger turned to a kind of hollow silence. Some people cried. Some argued. One engineer, a kid named Jake who'd joined right out of Stanford, just stared at him and said, "I turned down Google for this." By 11 o'clock it was done. 16 people walked out of the building carrying boxes with their desk plants, framed photos, and company-branded hoodies they'd probably never wear again. Marcus stood in the now empty office, surrounded by monitors that still glowed with code his former team had written. The silence was overwhelming. He'd expected to feel relief. Instead, he felt hollow, like he'd carved something essential out of himself and couldn't remember what it was. His phone had been buzzing all morning, but he'd ignored it. Now he checked the messages. Most were from employees he'd just fired, some angry, some pleading, some just asking why. There was one from his younger sister, Natalie, asking if he wanted to grab dinner that week. There was another from his landlord reminding him that rent was due on the 1st. And there was one from a number he didn't recognize. "We need to talk. Meet me at the trailhead off Skyline Drive at 8 p.m. Come alone." Marcus stared at the message for a long time. He didn't recognize the number, and the tone felt wrong, almost theatrical. But there was a part of him, maybe the same part that had convinced him he could build a billion-dollar company from nothing, that was curious. Maybe it was a potential investor who'd heard about the layoffs. Maybe it was someone who wanted to make an offer. Maybe it was nothing. He spent the rest of the day tying up loose ends. He drafted emails to remaining clients, updated the company's bank account access, and archived files that no one would probably ever look at again. Around 4 in the afternoon, he drove home to his apartment in Mountain View, a modest one-bedroom that still felt too expensive for what it was. He showered, changed into jeans and a hoodie, and sat on his couch, staring at his phone. The smart thing would have been to ignore the message. The smart thing would have been to call someone, tell them where he was going, maybe even call the police. But Marcus Valera had spent the last 5 years making decisions based on instinct rather than caution, and that instinct had gotten him this far, even if this far meant broke and alone in an empty apartment. At 7:15, he got into his Tesla Model S, the one extravagance he'd allowed himself when the Series A funding closed 2 years earlier. The car had been a symbol then, a statement that he'd made it. Now it just felt like a reminder of how quickly things could fall apart. He punched the address into the navigation system, Skyline Boulevard, a winding road that ran along the ridge of the Santa Cruz Mountains. The trailhead was about 30 minutes away. As he drove, the city lights gave way to darkness, the kind of complete absence of light that only exists in the mountains at night. The road twisted and climbed, and Marcus felt his stomach tighten with each turn. He didn't know it then, but by midnight, Marcus Valera would be gone, and his Tesla, empty and still running, would be found on a logging road 12 miles deeper into the mountains, its headlights cutting through the fog like a ghost refusing to disappear. Marcus arrived at the trailhead at 7:53. The parking area was little more than a dirt pullout on the side of Skyline Boulevard, marked by a weathered wooden sign that read Bear Creek Trail in faded letters. There were no other cars, no streetlights, just the sweep of his headlights across empty gravel and the dark wall of redwoods beyond. He sat in the car for a moment, engine running, heat on, trying to decide if this was monumentally stupid or just regular stupid. The message still glowed on his phone screen. Come alone. Who talked like that in real life? It felt like something out of a movie, and not a good one. But he'd come this far. Marcus turned off the engine and stepped out into the cold. The temperature had dropped at least 15 degrees since he'd left Mountain View. His breath formed clouds in the air. The silence was absolute except for the faint rustle of wind through the trees and the distant sound of something, an animal maybe, moving through the underbrush. He checked his phone. 8 o'clock exactly. No new messages. He waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Marcus walked to the edge of the parking area and peered down the trail, but it disappeared into darkness after about 20 feet. He considered calling out, but something stopped him. The whole situation felt wrong, like a setup, though for what he couldn't imagine. He wasn't important enough to kidnap. He didn't have enemies, at least not the kind who'd lure him into the mountains at night. At 8:15, he decided to leave. Whatever this was, it wasn't worth freezing in the dark. He turned back toward his car and stopped. There was someone standing next to his Tesla. Marcus's heart kicked hard in his chest. The figure was just a silhouette, backlit by the faint glow of the car's interior lights. Average height, wearing what looked like a dark jacket and jeans. He couldn't make out a face. Marcus Valera? The voice was male, calm, almost friendly. Yeah. Who are you? The figure didn't move closer. Someone who knows what you did today. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. What I did today? I laid off my team. It's not exactly a secret. Half of them probably posted about it on LinkedIn already. That's not what I'm talking about. There was a pause, and in that pause, Marcus became acutely aware of how isolated they were. No cars had passed on Skyline in the 15 minutes he'd been standing there. No hikers. No one. Look, Marcus said, trying to keep his voice steady. I don't know what this is about, but if you've got something to say, just say it. I'm not playing games. The figure took a step forward, and Marcus instinctively took a step back. 3 weeks ago, your lead investor pulled out of your Series B. Do you know why? Marcus hesitated. They said it was a portfolio rebalancing. Internal strategy shift. They lied. Another step forward. They pulled out because someone sent them information about Sentinel AI's data practices. About where you were really getting your training data. Marcus's stomach dropped. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. The voice was harder now, less friendly. You scraped proprietary datasets from companies that trusted you with API access. You repackaged their data and sold it as your own insights. That's not innovation, Marcus. That's theft. For a moment, Marcus couldn't speak. It was true. Not all of it, but enough. In the early days, when they were desperate for data to train their models, he'd made decisions that lived in a gray area. He'd told himself it was standard practice, that everyone did it, that the terms of service were vague enough to provide cover. But he'd known deep down that it was wrong. Who are you? Marcus asked again, his voice barely above a whisper. Someone who's been watching. Someone who knows that today wasn't about money. It was about covering your tracks. You fired your team because they were starting to ask questions. That's insane. I fired them because we're out of cash. Then why did you wipe the backup servers this afternoon? Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. He had wiped the servers, deleted old datasets, cleaned up the archives. He'd told himself it was just good operational hygiene, tying up loose ends. But the truth was more complicated. I want you to understand something, the figure said. And now he was close enough that Marcus could see his face in the faint moonlight. He was younger than Marcus expected, maybe late 20s, with sharp features and eyes that reflected the light like an animal's. What you built wasn't just unethical, it was dangerous. You created a system that could predict human behavior by violating their privacy, and you sold it to the highest bidder without thinking about the consequences. I never. You did. And now you're going to answer for it. Marcus's instinct was to run, but his legs felt frozen. Are you threatening me? The young man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I'm giving you a choice. You can disappear tonight, walk away from all of this, and never come back to the tech world. Or you can stay, and I promise you, everything you've done will come out. Every data set you stole, every lie you told investors, every corner you cut. Your name will be synonymous with fraud. You can't do that. I already have. The files are ready. All I have to do is send them. Marcus's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't how the world worked. People didn't get ambushed in parking lots by vigilantes with thumb drives full of evidence. But even as he thought it, he knew it was naive. The tech world was full of people who'd been destroyed overnight by leaks, by whistleblowers, by angry former employees with axes to grind. What do you want? Marcus asked. I told you. Disappear. And if I don't? The young man pulled out his phone and held it up. On the screen was an email draft, addressed to TechCrunch, The Verge, and a dozen other outlets. The subject line read, Sentinel AI Founder's Secret Data Theft Operation. Attached were files, dozens of them. Your choice, the young man said. Marcus stared at the phone, at the email that could destroy what was left of his life. He thought about his sister, about his parents in Sacramento who still bragged to their friends about their son, the tech founder. He thought about Priya, who'd probably laugh when she heard the news. He thought about the 16 people he'd fired that morning who'd probably cheer. I need time, Marcus said. You have until midnight. After that, I send it. How will I? But the young man was already walking away, back toward the trail, disappearing into the darkness like he'd never been there at all. Marcus stood alone in the parking lot, his heart pounding, his hands shaking. He looked at his Tesla, at the warm glow of its interior, and for a moment, he considered just getting in and driving home, calling a lawyer, calling the police, calling someone who could help him make sense of this. Instead, he got in the car, started the engine, and drove deeper into the mountains. The navigation system showed a network of logging roads that branched off Skyline, old routes used by timber companies decades ago. Most were barely maintained, but they were passable. Marcus didn't have a plan, not really. He just needed to think, needed to be somewhere no one could find him. He turned onto a narrow dirt road marked only by a faded yellow gate that hung open. The Tesla's headlights cut through the fog that had started to roll in from the coast. Trees pressed in on both sides, their branches scraping against the car's roof. Marcus drove for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. His phone had lost signal 5 minutes in. The road climbed higher, twisting back on itself, until he reached a small clearing overlooking the valley below. He could see the faint glow of San Jose in the distance, a constellation of lights that felt impossibly far away. He put the car in park, but left the engine running. He needed the heat. He needed the light. He needed something to anchor him to reality. And then, for reasons he would never be able to explain, Marcus Valera opened the door and stepped out into the fog. He walked to the edge of the clearing and looked down into the darkness. He thought about the choice he'd been given. He thought about everything he'd built and everything he'd destroyed. He thought about the person he'd become and the person he'd wanted to be. Behind him, the Tesla sat running, its headlights still on, waiting for a driver who would never return. The first person to notice something was wrong was Marcus's sister, Natalie. She'd sent him 3 texts on Wednesday morning. Casual stuff, asking if he'd seen the new season of a show they both watched, reminding him about their mom's birthday next week, sending him a meme about startup culture that she thought he'd find funny. By noon, when he hadn't responded to any of them, she started to worry. Marcus was always on his phone. Always. Even during family dinners. Even at movies, even at 2 in the morning when normal people were asleep. She called him twice. Both times it went straight to voicemail. By 3 o'clock, Natalie was worried enough to call his apartment. No answer. She tried his work number, but it just rang and rang in an empty office. Finally, she called Priya Mehta, whose number she'd saved from a company holiday party the year before. "Have you heard from Marcus?" Natalie asked, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. There was a pause on the other end. "I haven't worked with Marcus in 6 months," Priya said carefully. "Why? What's going on?" "I can't reach him. He's not answering his phone, and he always answers his phone." Another pause. "Natalie, I don't know if you've heard, but Marcus laid off his entire team yesterday. The company's basically done. He's probably just dealing with that. He'd still answer my texts." Priya's tone softened. "Look, I know you're worried, but Marcus has a tendency to disappear into his own head when things go wrong. Give him a day. He'll surface." But Natalie couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She drove to his apartment in Mountain View that evening, used the spare key he'd given her years ago, and let herself in. The apartment was neat, almost too neat. His laptop was on the kitchen counter, closed. His bed was made. There was a coffee mug in the sink, rinsed but not washed. Everything looked normal except for the fact that Marcus wasn't there. She called the police at 8:30 that night. The officer who took her report was polite but not particularly concerned. "Ma'am, your brother is an adult. He's been gone for, 36 hours? That's not unusual, especially if he's going through a stressful time. Most missing persons cases resolve themselves within 48 hours. But his phone is off. He never turns his phone off. Maybe he needed a break. Maybe he went camping, went to clear his head. Does he have friends he might be staying with?" Natalie thought about it. Marcus had work friends, or at least he used to, but she didn't know how to reach any of them. His social life had shrunk over the past few years as Sentinel AI consumed more and more of his time. "I don't know," she admitted. "Tell you what," the officer said. "Give it another 24 hours. If you still haven't heard from him by Thursday night, call us back and we'll open an official investigation. In the meantime, try his credit cards, see if there's any activity. Check his social media. Sometimes people leave clues without realizing it." Natalie spent the rest of the night doing exactly that. She logged into Marcus's Netflix account. They shared a family plan, and saw that he hadn't watched anything since Monday. She checked his Instagram, which he rarely used, and found nothing new. She didn't have access to his credit cards, but she called their parents in Sacramento and asked if they'd heard from him. "Not since Sunday," their mother said, her voice tight with sudden worry. "Natalie, what's wrong? Is Marcus okay?" "I'm sure he's fine," Natalie lied. "I just haven't been able to reach him. If he calls you, tell him to call me, okay?" She didn't sleep that night. Thursday morning, Natalie filed an official missing persons report. This time, she got a detective, a middle-aged woman named Sarah Chen, who seemed to take the situation more seriously. "Walk me through the last time you had contact with him," Detective Chen said, her pen poised over a notepad. Natalie explained the texts. The phone calls, the empty apartment. She mentioned the layoffs at Sentinel AI, the stress Marcus had been under, the fact that his phone was off. "Do you know what kind of car he drives?" Chen asked. "A Tesla, Model S, dark blue." Chen made a note. "We'll put out a bolo. Be on the lookout for the vehicle." "Do you have the license plate number?" Natalie didn't, but she remembered Marcus mentioning once that his Tesla was registered through the company for tax purposes. Chen made a call, and within an hour they had the plate number and the vehicle's VIN. "Here's what's interesting," Chen said, looking at her computer screen. "Tesla vehicles have GPS tracking built in. If your brother's car is still on, we should be able to locate it. I'm going to need to get a warrant to access that data, but given the circumstances, I don't think that'll be a problem." The warrant came through Friday morning. By noon, Detective Chen was calling Natalie with news. "We found the car," she said. "It's on a logging road off Skyline Boulevard, up in the mountains above Palo Alto. We're sending units up there now." Natalie felt her heart stop. Is Marcus with the car?" "We don't know yet. I'll call you as soon as we know more." The next 3 hours were the longest of Natalie's life. She sat in her apartment in San Francisco staring at her phone, unable to eat, unable to think about anything except her brother alone in the mountains. She kept imagining scenarios. Maybe he'd gone for a hike and gotten lost. Maybe he'd had a breakdown and just needed space. Maybe he'd had an accident and was hurt somewhere, waiting for help. When Detective Chen finally called back, her voice was carefully neutral. "We found the vehicle. It was parked in a clearing about 12 miles off Skyline. The engine was still running when we got there, but the battery was dead. There's no sign of your brother." "What do you mean, no sign?" "I mean, he's not in the car and he's not in the immediate area. We've got search and rescue teams combing the surrounding forest, but so far, nothing. The driver's side door was open. His phone was on the passenger seat, dead. His wallet was in the center console. Keys were still in the ignition." Natalie felt like she was falling. That doesn't make sense. Why would he just leave his car running in the middle of nowhere? "We don't know, but we're treating this as a critical missing persons case now. We've got dogs, we've got helicopters with thermal imaging, we've got volunteers from the local search and rescue organization. If your brother is out there, we'll find him." The search lasted 5 days. Volunteers came from all over the Bay Area, hikers who knew the trails, tech workers who'd read about the case online, even some of the employees Marcus had fired, who showed up despite everything because they still cared. The story had started to spread on social media. Tech founder vanishes after layoffs. Some people were sympathetic, others were less kind, speculating that Marcus had staged his own disappearance to avoid legal trouble, or that he'd taken his own life out of guilt. Natalie spent every day at the search command post, a cluster of tents and vehicles set up at the trailhead where Marcus's phone had last pinged a cell tower. She watched as teams went out at dawn and came back at dusk, exhausted and empty-handed. She listened as search coordinators discussed grid patterns and probability zones and the challenges of searching dense forest at night. Detective Chen kept her updated on the investigation. "We've interviewed everyone we can find who had contact with your brother in the days before he disappeared," she said on the 3rd day of the search. "Employees, investors, vendors. No one reported anything unusual." He fired his team Tuesday morning, spent the afternoon at the office, went home around 4. After that, nothing until his car was found Wednesday morning. "What about his phone?" Natalie asked. "Can't you see where he went?" The phone was off or out of battery from Tuesday evening onward. The last location we have is his apartment in Mountain View at around 7 p.m. After that, it goes dark. But here's what's strange. His Tesla's navigation system shows that he drove to a trailhead on Skyline Boulevard at around 8 p.m. Tuesday night. He stayed there for approximately 20 minutes, then drove to the location where we found the car. The vehicle's logs show it was in park with the engine running from approximately 8:40 p.m. Tuesday until the battery died Wednesday morning. So he went to meet someone, Natalie said, at the trailhead. That's why he drove up there. That's our working theory. But we don't know who, and we don't know why. We've checked his email, his text messages, his call logs. There's nothing that indicates he was planning to meet anyone. What about cameras? Traffic cameras? Security cameras? Chen shook her head. Skyline Boulevard is pretty remote. There are no traffic cameras up there, and the few businesses in the area don't have exterior surveillance that covers the road. We're checking with nearby residents to see if anyone has doorbell cameras or dash cams, but so far, nothing useful. On the 5th day, the official search was scaled back. The dogs had lost any scent trail days ago. The helicopters had covered hundreds of acres without finding any sign of Marcus. The probability maps showed that if he'd wandered into the forest, he could be anywhere within a 50-square-mile area, and much of that terrain was nearly impossible to navigate even in daylight. We're not giving up, Detective Chen told Natalie. But we have to be realistic about our resources. We'll continue to have patrols in the area, and we're asking hikers and locals to keep an eye out. But the active search, the teams, the helicopters, we can't sustain that indefinitely. Natalie nodded, numb. She'd known this was coming. She'd seen the way the search coordinators looked at each other, the way they'd stopped talking about when we find him and started saying if. That night, she drove up to the clearing where Marcus's car had been found. The Tesla had been towed to an impound lot for forensic examination, but the tire tracks were still visible in the dirt. She stood at the edge of the clearing and looked out at the valley below, at the lights of the cities where millions of people were going about their lives, unaware that her brother had vanished from this exact spot. People who knew the area said it was easy to get disoriented in these mountains, especially at night. The fog rolled in without warning. The trails weren't well marked. There were cliffs, ravines, places where one wrong step could be fatal. But Marcus wasn't a hiker. He wasn't the kind of person who went wandering into the wilderness. He was a tech founder who lived in front of screens, who probably couldn't identify a poison oak plant if his life depended on it. So what had happened? What had made him drive up here, leave his car running, and walk away into the darkness? Natalie didn't have answers. And as the days turned into weeks, it seemed like no one else did either. 3 months after Marcus Valera disappeared, his face was still on flyers stapled to telephone poles throughout the Bay Area, but most people had stopped looking at them. The initial media frenzy had died down after the first few weeks. There had been articles in TechCrunch and Wired, a segment on the local news, even a thread on Reddit that had gained some traction before fading into the endless scroll of internet speculation. But without new developments, without a body or a credible lead, the story lost its momentum. People moved on. The news cycle churned forward. Natalie didn't move on. She'd taken a leave of absence from her job as a graphic designer to focus on finding her brother. Every morning she woke up in Marcus's apartment. She'd moved in after he disappeared, unable to let go of the space that still smelled faintly like his cologne, and spent hours combing through his life, looking for clues that the police might have missed. She'd gone through his laptop a dozen times. His emails were mostly work-related, investor updates, product roadmaps, HR discussions about hiring and firing. There were a few personal messages, exchanges with their parents, a thread with Priya from before their falling out, some automated notifications from LinkedIn and Twitter. Nothing that suggested he was planning to disappear. Nothing that explained why he'd driven into the mountains that night. His browser history was equally mundane. News sites, GitHub repositories, Stack Overflow threads, the occasional YouTube video about machine learning or startup strategy. The last thing he'd searched for on Tuesday afternoon before he disappeared was how to permanently delete cloud backups. Natalie had shown this to Detective Chen, who'd noted it but didn't seem to think it was particularly significant. People in tech delete things all the time, Chen had said, especially when a company is shutting down. It's not necessarily suspicious. But Natalie couldn't shake the feeling that it meant something. She'd also tracked down and interviewed several of Marcus's former employees, the ones who'd been laid off the day before he vanished. Most were still angry, still processing the sudden loss of their jobs, but none of them seemed to know anything useful. Jake, the Stanford kid who'd turned down Google, met her at a coffee shop in Palo Alto. He looked tired, like he hadn't been sleeping well. I wish I could help, he said, stirring his coffee absently. But honestly, Marcus had been distant for weeks before the layoffs. He stopped coming to stand-ups, stopped reviewing code. It was like he was already gone, you know? Mentally checked out. Did he seem scared? Natalie asked. Like someone was threatening him? Jake thought about it. Not scared, exactly. More like stressed? Paranoid, maybe? He kept asking questions about our data security protocols. About who had access to what. At the time, I thought he was just worried about the company failing. But looking back, I don't know. Maybe there was something else going on. Natalie made notes, but she didn't know what to do with the information. Stressed and paranoid described half the founders in Silicon Valley. She'd also reached out to Priya Mehta, who'd agreed to meet for lunch in San Francisco. Priya was working at a new startup now, something involving blockchain and supply chain management. She seemed happier, more relaxed than Natalie remembered from the holiday party. I heard what happened, Priya said as they sat down. I'm sorry. I know Marcus and I didn't end on good terms, but I never wanted anything like this. Do you think he could have done something illegal? Natalie asked bluntly. Something that would make him want to disappear? Priya's expression shifted, became more guarded. Why would you ask that? Because nothing else makes sense. He wasn't suicidal. He wasn't reckless. But he drove into the mountains in the middle of the night and vanished. That's not normal behavior unless he was running from something. Priya was quiet for a long moment. There were things about Sentinel AI that bothered me, she finally said. Things about how we were sourcing our training data. Marcus always said it was fine, that we were operating within the terms of service, but I wasn't so sure. That's part of why I left. I didn't want to be associated with it if things went sideways. What kind of things? We were scraping data from companies that had given us API access for integration purposes. We'd tell them we needed access to build connectors, but then we'd use that data to train our models. It was technically legal, maybe, but ethically questionable. And if any of those companies found out and decided to sue, it could have been bad. Really bad. Natalie felt a chill run through her. Did anyone find out? Not while I was there, but Marcus was always worried about it. He used to have nightmares about getting sued, about the company imploding because of some legal technicality. He was paranoid about covering our tracks. After lunch, Natalie sat in her car for a long time, thinking. If Marcus had been doing something legally questionable, and if someone had found out, that could explain why he'd disappeared. Maybe he'd been threatened. Maybe he'd been blackmailed. Maybe he'd decided to run rather than face the consequences, but it still didn't explain the car. Why leave it running? Why leave his phone and wallet? If he was planning to disappear, wouldn't he have taken those things with him? Detective Chen had her own theories, though she was careful not to share them too explicitly with Natalie. In cases like this, she'd said during one of their weekly check-ins, we have to consider all possibilities. Foul play, voluntary disappearance, suicide, accident. Each one has different indicators, and right now we don't have enough evidence to rule any of them out. What does your gut tell you? Natalie had asked. Chen had hesitated. My gut tells me that your brother met someone at that trailhead. Someone he didn't want anyone else to know about. And whatever happened during that meeting, it led to him driving deeper into the mountains and leaving his car. Beyond that, I don't know. But I promise you, we're still working on it. The forensic examination of the Tesla had revealed some interesting details. There were no signs of struggle inside the vehicle. No blood, no damage, nothing to suggest violence. But there were fingerprints on the passenger side door handle, prints that didn't match Marcus or anyone in the police database. There were also traces of mud on the floor mats, a specific type of clay soil that was common in the mountains, but not in Mountain View where Marcus lived. Someone else was in that car, Chen had explained, either before Marcus drove up to the mountains or while he was up there. We're trying to identify who, but without a match in the system, it's difficult. The cell phone records had been equally frustrating. Marcus's phone had received a text message at 4:30 p.m. on Tuesday from a number that turned out to be a burner phone purchased with cash at a convenience store in San Jose. The message had been deleted from Marcus's phone, but the carrier had a record of it being sent. They couldn't recover the content, but the timestamp matched up with when Marcus would have been at his apartment just a few hours before he drove to the mountains. "We think that message is what prompted him to go to the trailhead," Chen said. "But without knowing what it said, we're just guessing." As spring turned to summer, Natalie watched as the investigation slowly ground to a halt. There were no new leads. No witnesses came forward. The anonymous tips that had flooded in during the first few weeks, mostly from people who claimed to have seen Marcus at gas stations or hiking trails or airports, had all turned out to be dead ends. The tech community had largely moved on. Sentinel AI's assets had been quietly sold off to pay creditors. The office space had been leased to a new startup. It was like Marcus's company had never existed, but his family couldn't move on. Their mother had aged years in a matter of months, her face drawn and pale, her eyes always red from crying. Their father had thrown himself into the search with an almost manic energy, printing flyers, organizing volunteer search parties, posting on every social media platform he could find. Natalie had become the family's liaison with the police, the one who made the weekly calls to Detective Chen, the one who kept track of every tiny development in the case. She'd also started her own investigation, one that the police didn't know about. She'd hired a private investigator named Raymond Torres, a former cop who specialized in missing persons cases. Torres was expensive, but he was thorough. He'd started by retracing Marcus's steps in the days before he disappeared, interviewing people the police had already talked to, looking for inconsistencies or details that might have been overlooked. "Your brother was careful," Torres told her during one of their meetings. "He didn't leave much of a trail, but careful people make mistakes when they're under pressure. We just have to find the mistake." Torres had discovered something interesting. 2 days before Marcus disappeared, he'd withdrawn $5,000 in cash from an ATM in Palo Alto. The police had noted the withdrawal in their report, but hadn't considered it significant. Torres thought differently. $5,000 is a lot of cash, he said. "And your brother wasn't the type to carry cash, right? He used his phone for everything. So why would he suddenly need that much physical money?" Natalie didn't have an answer. Torres had also found a witness the police had missed, a clerk at a gas station on Skyline Boulevard, who remembered seeing a dark blue Tesla on Tuesday night around 8 p.m. "He came in to buy a bottle of water," the clerk said when Torres interviewed him. "Seemed nervous, kept checking his phone. I remember because we don't get a lot of Teslas up here, mostly hikers and locals." "Was he alone?" Torres asked. "Yeah, at least I didn't see anyone else in the car." It wasn't much, but it confirmed that Marcus had been at the trailhead area and that he'd been alone when he stopped for water. Whatever meeting he'd gone to, whoever he'd been planning to see, they hadn't been with him yet. By August, 4 months after Marcus disappeared, Natalie had compiled a thick binder full of notes, interviews, timelines, and theories. She'd mapped out every road in the area where his car was found. She'd studied topographical maps, weather reports, and search and rescue statistics. She'd become an expert on the Santa Cruz Mountains, on the dangers of hiking at night, on the dozens of ways a person could vanish without a trace. But she still didn't know what had happened to her brother. And then, on a warm afternoon in late September, Detective Chen called with news that would change everything. "We found something," Chen said, her voice tight with controlled excitement. "A hiker discovered a backpack about 3 miles from where Marcus's car was found. It's been out there for months, weathered and partially buried, but we've confirmed it belonged to your brother. And Natalie, there's something inside you need to see." Natalie met Detective Chen at the police station in Palo Alto on a Thursday morning. The sky was overcast, threatening rain, and the air had that heavy quality that comes before a storm. She'd barely slept the night before, her mind racing with possibilities about what could be in Marcus's backpack. Chen led her to a small conference room where the backpack sat on a table, sealed in a clear evidence bag. It was a black North Face pack, the kind you could buy at any outdoor store, and it looked like it had been through hell. The fabric was stained with mud and mildew, one of the straps was torn, and there were small holes that looked like they'd been made by animals. "We found it wedged under a fallen log," Chen explained. "A hiker's dog actually discovered it. The location is about 3 miles northeast of where your brother's car was found." in a pretty remote area off the main trails. It's been out there for months, exposed to the elements. How do you know it's Marcus's? Natalie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Chen opened a folder and showed her photos. We found his driver's license inside, along with some other personal items, but more importantly, we found this. She pulled out another evidence bag, this one containing a small notebook with a water-damaged cover. Natalie's breath caught. She recognized it immediately. Marcus had always carried a notebook, one of those moleskin journals that he used to sketch out ideas and take notes during meetings. She'd teased him about it once, calling him old-fashioned in a world of tablets and smartphones. Can I see it? She asked. Chen hesitated. The contents are part of an active investigation, but given the circumstances, I think you have a right to know what we found. Just understand that some of this is disturbing. She opened the evidence bag carefully and placed the notebook on the table. The pages were warped from moisture and some of the ink had run, but much of it was still legible. Chen flipped to a page near the end, marked with a yellow evidence tag. The handwriting was definitely Marcus's. Natalie would recognize it anywhere, but the words made her stomach turn. Tuesday, 7:45 p.m. Going to meet him. I don't know what else to do. He says he has proof, says he'll destroy everything if I don't show up. Maybe I deserve it. Maybe this is how it ends. Below that, in shakier handwriting, if anyone finds this, I'm sorry. I thought I was building something good. I thought the ends justified the means. I was wrong about everything. Natalie felt tears burning her eyes. Who was he meeting? Who's him? We don't know, Chen said. But there's more. She flipped back several pages to entries from the days before Marcus disappeared. Friday, the investor pulled out. They know. Someone told them about the data scraping. I tried to call them, tried to explain, but they won't even talk to me. It's over. Saturday, can't sleep. Keep thinking about what Priya said before she left. She was right. I cut corners. I told myself everyone does it, but that doesn't make it okay. How did I become this person? Monday, laid off the team today. Worst day of my life. Jake looked at me like I'd betrayed him. Maybe I did. Deleted the backup servers, covered my tracks. Feel sick about it. Tuesday, 2:00 p.m. Got a message from an unknown number. He knows everything. Every data set we scraped, every TOS we violated, every lie I told. He wants to meet tonight. Says if I don't show up, he'll send everything to the press. I believe him. Chen let Natalie read through the entries, watching her carefully. Based on these notes, it's clear your brother was under significant pressure. He was being blackmailed, or at least threatened with exposure. The question is, who was threatening him and what happened when they met? You think someone hurt him? Natalie said. It wasn't a question. I think we need to treat this as a potential homicide investigation, Chen said carefully. The backpack was found 3 miles from his car, in the opposite direction from any established trails. That suggests your brother was either running from something, or he was taken somewhere, and the fact that the backpack was hidden under a log, rather than just lying on the ground, suggests someone might have tried to conceal it. Natalie's mind was reeling. What else was in the backpack? Chen pulled out several more evidence bags. A flashlight, dead batteries, a water bottle, empty, a protein bar wrapper, and this. She held up a bag containing a small USB drive. We're having our tech team analyze it now. But preliminary examination shows it contains files related to Sentinel AI, datasets, source code, internal communications. It looks like your brother was carrying evidence of what he'd done. Why would he do that? Maybe he was planning to turn himself in. Maybe he wanted leverage in case the meeting went wrong. Or maybe he was just scared and didn't know what else to do. Chen paused. There's one more thing. We found traces of blood on the inside of the backpack. Not much, just a few drops, but enough to test. It's your brother's blood type. Natalie felt the room spin. He was hurt. We don't know the circumstances yet. It could have been a minor injury, a cut from falling, a nosebleed from stress. But combined with everything else, it's concerning. Over the next 2 weeks, The investigation shifted into high gear. The discovery of the backpack had given the police new leads to pursue, new evidence to analyze. The tech team extracted data from the USB drive and confirmed that it contained detailed records of Sentinel AI's data practices, including logs that showed Marcus had knowingly violated the terms of service of multiple companies. "This is damning stuff," Chen told Natalie during one of their updates. "If this had gone public, your brother would have faced serious legal consequences, civil suits, possibly criminal charges. He was looking at the end of his career, at minimum." But the more important question was, who had been threatening to expose him? The police traced the burner phone that had sent Marcus the text message on Tuesday afternoon. It had been purchased at a 7-Eleven in San Jose, paid for with cash. The store's security footage from that day showed a young man, maybe late 20s, wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses. The image quality was poor, and facial recognition software couldn't get a match. "We've shown this image to everyone who knew your brother," Chen said. "Employees, investors, competitors. No one recognizes him." They also analyzed the mud on Marcus's Tesla floor mats. The soil composition matched the area where the backpack was found, which suggested that Marcus, or someone who'd been in his car, had walked through that area. But there were no footprints preserved after so many months, no physical trail to follow. The search teams went back into the mountains, focusing on the area where the backpack had been discovered. They used cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, and drone surveys. They searched for 3 straight days, covering a 10-mile radius. They found nothing. No body, no additional evidence. No sign of what had happened to Marcus Valera after he'd left his car running in that clearing. But they did find something else, something that opened up an entirely new line of investigation. About half a mile from where the backpack was discovered, searchers found a small campsite that had been abandoned months earlier. There was a fire pit with old ashes, some empty food containers, and a tarp that had been strung up between trees as a makeshift shelter. It looked like someone had been living there, at least temporarily. "Homeless encampment," one of the search team members suggested. But Detective Chen wasn't so sure. "This is pretty far from any road or trail. Homeless individuals usually camp closer to civilization, where they have access to food and services. This is deliberate isolation." They collected everything from the campsite, the tarp, the food containers, cigarette butts from the fire pit, even soil samples. The forensic analysis took another week, but when the results came back, they were startling. DNA from the cigarette butts matched the unidentified fingerprints found in Marcus's Tesla. "So the same person who was in your brother's car was also camping in these mountains?" Chen explained to Natalie. "That's not a coincidence. This person was either waiting for your brother, or they stayed in the area after he disappeared." "Why would someone camp out here for months?" Natalie asked. "That's what we're trying to figure out. But here's what I think happened." Chen pulled out a map and pointed to the various locations. "Your brother drove to the trailhead here around 8 p.m. He met someone, our mystery person, and they talked. Maybe the conversation got heated. Maybe your brother felt threatened. He got back in his car and drove to this clearing, about 12 miles away. Our mystery person either followed him or was already with him in the car. And then something happened that made your brother leave his car and head into the forest. Maybe he was running. Maybe he was being chased. He made it about 3 miles before he either dropped his backpack or it was taken from him. And somewhere in that area, our mystery person set up camp and stayed there for weeks, possibly months." "Why would they stay?" Natalie asked. "If they hurt Marcus, why not just leave?" Chen's expression was grim. Maybe they were waiting to make sure he was never found. Maybe they were watching to see if the police would discover something. Or maybe, she hesitated, maybe they were waiting for something else entirely. The police released a public appeal for information, including the security footage image of the young man who'd purchased the burner phone. The story made national news this time. "Tech founder's disappearance linked to mysterious campsite," read the headlines. The Reddit threads exploded with theories. True crime podcasters devoted entire episodes to the case. Tips started flooding in. People claimed to have seen the man in the baseball cap. Others reported suspicious activity in the mountains. A few claimed to know who he was, though most of those tips turned out to be false leads or attention seekers. But one tip stood out. A woman named Jennifer Zhao called the police hotline and said she recognized the man in the security footage. "I think that's my brother," she said. "His name is David Zhao. He used to work in tech, but he had a breakdown about a year ago. He became obsessed with data privacy, with how companies were exploiting user information. He quit his job, cut off contact with our family, and disappeared. I haven't seen him in 8 months." Detective Chen interviewed Jennifer in person. She brought photos of her brother, clear, recent photos that showed a young man with sharp features and intense eyes. When Chen showed these photos to the 7-Eleven clerk who'd sold the burner phone, he said, "Yeah, that could be him. Hard to say for sure, but the build is right." "Did your brother know Marcus Valera?" Chen asked Jennifer. "I don't know. He never mentioned him specifically, but David was really involved in tech privacy advocacy before he disappeared. He was always talking about companies that violated user trust, that scraped data without consent. It was like a crusade for him." "Do you have any idea where he might be now?" Jennifer shook her head, tears in her eyes. "I've been trying to find him for months. I filed a missing persons report, but the police said he's an adult and he left voluntarily, so there's not much they can do. I'm worried about him. He wasn't well, mentally. He was paranoid, angry all the time. I'm afraid he might have done something he can't take back." The police issued a warrant for David Zhao's arrest on suspicion of involvement in Marcus Valera's disappearance. His photo was distributed to law enforcement agencies across the state, but David Zhao, like Marcus Valera, seemed to have vanished without a trace. Natalie sat in Marcus's apartment that night, staring at the photos Detective Chen had given her of David Zhao. She studied his face, trying to understand what had driven him to confront her brother. What had happened in those mountains? Whether Marcus was still alive somewhere or if she'd been searching for a ghost all these months. She thought about the notebook entry. Maybe this is how it ends. Had Marcus known he was in danger? Had he gone to that meeting expecting violence? Or had he simply been a man who'd made mistakes, who'd been confronted by someone who wanted justice, and who'd paid a price he never saw coming? The questions haunted her, but at least now, finally, they had a name. They had a suspect. They had a direction to search. The investigation was far from over. But for the first time since Marcus disappeared, Natalie felt like they were close to the truth. It took another 6 weeks before the police finally located David Zhao. He wasn't hiding in the mountains. He wasn't on the run in some remote location. He was living in a small apartment in Oakland, working under the table at a community tech repair shop, using a fake name and paying rent in cash. He'd been there for 2 months, living quietly, almost invisibly, in a neighborhood where people minded their own business. A tip from a customer at the repair shop, someone who'd seen his photo on the news and thought the resemblance was too strong to ignore, led police to his door on a rainy morning in early November. Detective Chen was there for the arrest. She told Natalie later that David hadn't resisted, hadn't tried to run. He'd simply opened the door, looked at the officers standing there and said, "I've been waiting for you." The interrogation lasted 7 hours. Natalie wasn't allowed to watch it live, but Chen gave her access to the video recording a few days later, after David's lawyer had reviewed it and cleared it for the family to see. Natalie sat in the same conference room where she'd first seen Marcus's backpack, and she watched as the man who might have killed her brother told his story. David Zhao looked smaller in person than he did in the photos. He was thin, almost gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes, and a nervous energy that made him constantly shift in his chair. But when he spoke, his voice was clear and steady. "I didn't kill Marcus Valera," he said at the beginning of the interrogation, "but I'm responsible for what happened to him. I need you to understand that." Detective Chen, sitting across from him, leaned forward. "Why don't you start from the beginning? Tell us how you knew Marcus." David took a breath. "I didn't know him personally, but I knew what he was doing. I worked in data security for 3 years before I quit. I saw how companies like Sentinel AI operated, how they exploited loopholes, how they scraped data they had no right to access, how they built entire business models on violating user privacy. It made me sick. So I started investigating. Investigating how? I'd infiltrate companies' systems, look for vulnerabilities, document their data practices, not to steal anything or cause damage, just to expose what they were doing. I'd send the information to journalists, to regulators, to anyone who'd listen. Most of the time, nothing happened. But I kept trying. And Sentinel AI? David's expression hardened. Sentinel AI was one of the worst. Marcus Valera was scraping proprietary data sets from companies that trusted him with API access. He was repackaging that data and selling it as his own insights. It was theft, plain and simple. And when I found proof, I knew I had to confront him. "So you contacted him," Chen said. "I sent him a message on Tuesday afternoon. I told him I had evidence of what he'd done and that I was going to release it to the press unless he met with me. I wanted to give him a chance to explain himself, to maybe make things right. I don't know what I expected, maybe a confession, maybe an apology. I just knew I couldn't let it go." "And he agreed to meet you?" "He didn't respond to the message, but I knew he'd come. I told him to meet me at the trailhead on Skyline Boulevard at 8 p.m. I chose that location because it was isolated, because I didn't want anyone else involved. I just wanted to talk to him." Chen pulled out a photo of the trailhead. "And did he show up?" David nodded. "He was late, but he came. He pulled up in his Tesla around 8:15. He got out of the car and I could see he was terrified. He kept looking around like he thought I'd brought someone with me. I tried to calm him down, told him I just wanted to talk, but he was panicking." "What did you talk about?" "I showed him the evidence I had. Logs of the data scraping, emails where he'd discussed covering their tracks, everything. I told him he had two choices. He could come forward voluntarily, admit what he'd done, and try to make amends, or I would release everything and destroy what was left of his reputation." "How did he react?" David's voice dropped. He broke down, started crying, saying he'd made mistakes, that he knew what he'd done was wrong, but he didn't know how to fix it. He said he'd already lost everything, his company, his team, his future. He begged me not to release the information, said it would destroy his family, that his parents would never recover from the shame. "And what did you say?" I told him I was sorry, but that wasn't my problem. That the people whose data he'd stolen deserved justice, and that he needed to face the consequences of his actions. David's hands were shaking now. That's when everything went wrong. Chen waited, letting the silence stretch. "Marcus got angry," David continued. "Started yelling at me, saying I was a self-righteous hypocrite. That I'd broken into his systems illegally, so I was just as bad as he was. He said if I released the information, he'd make sure I went to prison too. We argued for maybe 10 minutes and then he just got in his car and drove off." "Did you follow him?" "Not immediately. I stood there for a few minutes trying to figure out what to do. I'd expected him to either agree to come forward or to just accept that I was going to release the information. I hadn't expected him to run. So I got in my car and tried to follow him." "What kind of car were you driving?" "A 2015 Honda Civic, gray. I'd parked it about a quarter-mile down the road so Marcus wouldn't see it when he arrived." Chen made a note. "And you followed him into the mountains?" "I tried to, but his Tesla was faster than my car, and he knew the roads better than I did. I lost him after a few miles. I drove around for maybe half an hour, looking for him, but I couldn't find him. Eventually I gave up and went back to the trailhead." "What time was this?" "Maybe 9:30, 10 o'clock. I sat in my car for a while, trying to decide what to do next, and then I saw his Tesla coming back down the mountain. Natalie leaned closer to the screen, her heart pounding. It was driving slowly, David said, like he was looking for something. I ducked down in my seat so he wouldn't see me, and I watched as he turned onto one of the logging roads. I waited a few minutes, then I followed him. Why? Because I wanted to finish the conversation. I wanted to make him understand that running wasn't going to solve anything. So I drove up the logging road until I found his car. It was parked in a clearing, engine still running, headlights on. but Marcus wasn't in it. The driver's side door was open? Yes, and his phone was on the passenger seat. I got out of my car and called his name, but there was no answer. I walked around the clearing, looked down the trails, but I couldn't see him anywhere. It was dark and the fog was rolling in, and I started to get worried. Worried how? David's voice cracked. Worried that he'd done something to himself? That he'd driven up there to end things? I kept calling his name, kept searching, but I couldn't find him. I searched for maybe an hour and then I heard something. What did you hear? A sound, like someone moving through the brush, fast. I called out again, asked if it was Marcus, but whoever it was didn't answer. I tried to follow the sound, but I lost it in the darkness. And then I realized, what if Marcus thought I was chasing him? What if he was running from me? Chen's expression was unreadable. So, you think Marcus ran into the forest because he thought you were pursuing him? I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe he was just panicked and not thinking clearly. But I felt responsible. I'd pushed him to that point. So I decided to stay in the area, to keep looking for him. That's why you set up the campsite. David nodded. I couldn't just leave. I kept thinking, what if he's hurt out there? What if he needs help? So I bought supplies and set up camp about half a mile from where his car was parked. I searched every day for 2 weeks, covering as much ground as I could, but I never found any sign of him. Why didn't you call the police? Because I was afraid. Afraid they'd think I'd done something to him. Afraid they'd arrest me for hacking into Sentinel AI systems. I know it was wrong, I know I should have come forward, but I panicked. And the longer I waited, the harder it became to tell the truth. What about Marcus's backpack? The one we found 3 miles from his car? David looked confused. I never saw a backpack. I didn't even know he had one with him. Chen pulled out photos of the backpack and the notebook. These were found in a location you would have passed during your searches. You're saying you never saw them? Never. I swear. The interrogation continued for several more hours, with Chen and her partner pressing David on every detail, looking for inconsistencies, testing his story. But David's account remained consistent. He'd confronted Marcus, they'd argued. Marcus had driven away, and David had followed him out of concern. When he couldn't find Marcus, he'd stayed in the mountains searching, driven by guilt and fear. The police verified what they could. David's Honda Civic was found in a storage unit in Oakland, and forensic analysis confirmed that it had been driven on dirt roads consistent with the logging roads in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Mud samples from the tires matched the soil composition of the area where Marcus's car was found. Security footage from a camping supply store in San Jose showed David purchasing a tarp, sleeping bag, and other supplies 2 days after Marcus disappeared, which corroborated his story about setting up camp. But there were still gaps, still questions that David couldn't answer. If Marcus had run into the forest in a panic, why hadn't search and rescue teams found any trace of him? The dogs had covered that area extensively in the days after he disappeared. If he'd been injured or deceased in the immediate vicinity, they should have found him. And what about the blood in the backpack? David claimed he'd never seen it, never touched it. So how had it ended up 3 miles from Marcus's car, in a location that David said he'd searched multiple times? Detective Chen laid out the possibilities for Natalie in her office a week after David's arrest. Here's what we know for certain, Chen said. David Zhao confronted your brother about illegal data practices. They argued. Your brother drove into the mountains, and David followed him. At some point, your brother left his car and went into the forest. David stayed in the area for 2 weeks searching for him, before eventually leaving and going into hiding. Do you believe him? Natalie asked. Do you believe he didn't hurt Marcus? Chen was quiet for a moment. I believe he's telling the truth about most of it. His story checks out in the places where we can verify it. But there are still pieces missing. We don't know what happened in the hours between when Marcus left his car and when David claims he started searching for him. We don't know how the backpack ended up where it did, and we don't know where your brother is now. So what happens to David? He's been charged with stalking and harassment. and potentially with interfering with the police investigation by not coming forward sooner. But without a body, without direct evidence that he harmed your brother, we can't charge him with anything more serious. His lawyer is arguing that he was trying to expose corporate wrongdoing, that his intentions were good even if his methods were questionable. Natalie felt a wave of frustration wash over her. So that's it? We still don't know what happened to Marcus. We're not giving up, Chen said firmly. We're still searching. We're still investigating. But I want you to be prepared for the possibility that we may never have all the answers. The case remained open. Search teams continued to comb the mountains, though less frequently now. The police followed up on tips, interviewed witnesses, analyzed evidence. David Zhao was released on bail, pending trial, and returned to his sister's home under strict conditions. And Natalie Valera continued to search for her brother, driven by a hope that was becoming harder and harder to hold on to. It's been 18 months since Marcus Valera disappeared into the Santa Cruz Mountains, and the case remains one of the most perplexing missing persons investigations in Bay Area history. Natalie still lives in Marcus's apartment in Mountain View. She's turned one of the rooms into a command center of sorts. Walls covered with maps, timelines, photographs, and notes. She's become an expert on the terrain where her brother vanished, on the patterns of missing persons cases, on the psychology of people under extreme stress. She's hiked every trail within 10 miles of where his car was found, sometimes alone, sometimes with volunteers who still believe Marcus might be out there somewhere. People ask me why I don't move on. She told a local news reporter who did a follow-up story on the 1-year anniversary of Marcus's disappearance. But how do you move on when you don't know? When there's no body, no closure, no answers? He's my brother. I can't just forget him. The legal proceedings against David Zhao have been complicated and drawn out. His trial on stalking and harassment charges resulted in a conviction, but the sentence was light: 2 years probation, community service, and mandatory counseling. The judge acknowledged that while David's methods were illegal and his decision not to come forward was reprehensible, there was no evidence that he directly harmed Marcus. This is a tragedy born of obsession and poor judgment, the judge said during sentencing. Mr. Zhao believed he was pursuing justice, but his actions may have contributed to a man's death or disappearance. He will have to live with that knowledge for the rest of his life. David Zhao gave a statement after the trial, his voice thick with emotion. I think about Marcus Valera every day. I think about the conversation we had, about the fear in his eyes, about the fact that I pushed him to a breaking point. If I could go back and do things differently, I would. I would have gone to the authorities instead of confronting him myself. I would have thought about the human cost of my crusade. But I can't go back. All I can do is say that I'm sorry, and that I hope someday his family gets the answers they deserve. Natalie was in the courtroom that day. She didn't speak to David, didn't acknowledge him. But she listened to every word, searching for something. A clue, a slip, some indication that he knew more than he was saying. She found nothing. The tech community has largely moved on from the scandal of Sentinel AI's data practices. The information David had compiled was eventually released to journalists, and there were a few articles about the ethical gray areas of AI training data. But without Marcus around to face consequences, the story never gained the traction David had hoped for. Other scandals emerged. Other companies fell from grace, and Sentinel AI became just another cautionary tale in Silicon Valley's long history of ambition outpacing ethics. But for those who knew Marcus personally, the questions linger. Priya Mehta, his former co-founder, has spoken publicly about the case several times. Marcus was brilliant, but he was also reckless, she said in a podcast interview. He believed that if the technology was good enough, the ethics would sort themselves out later. A lot of founders think that way. They're so focused on building, on growing, on winning, that they don't stop to ask whether they should. Marcus paid the ultimate price for that mindset, and I think about that every day in my own work now. The employees Marcus laid off have scattered across the tech industry. Some harbor resentment, feeling that Marcus abandoned them when things got difficult. Others have more sympathy, recognizing that he was under impossible pressure. Jake, the Stanford graduate who turned down Google, now works at a startup focused on ethical AI. What happened to Marcus changed how I think about this industry, he said. It's not enough to build cool technology. You have to think about the impact, about who gets hurt, about what you're willing to compromise for success. I wish Marcus had learned that lesson before it was too late. Detective Sarah Chen continues to work the case, though it's no longer her primary focus. She checks in with Natalie every few weeks, updates her on any new tips or leads, most of which go nowhere. The truth is, we may never know exactly what happened that night. Chen admitted during one of their recent conversations. We have pieces of the puzzle, but not enough to see the full picture. Did Marcus run into the forest in a panic and succumb to the elements? Did he fall and injure himself in a place we haven't searched? Did something else happen that we haven't even considered? Without more evidence, we're just guessing. The mountains themselves have kept their secrets. Despite extensive searches, despite the efforts of professional search and rescue teams, despite the hundreds of volunteers who've combed the area, no trace of Marcus Valera has been found beyond the backpack and the abandoned Tesla. It's as if he simply ceased to exist the moment he stepped out of that car. Some people believe Marcus is still alive, that he staged his own disappearance to escape the consequences of his actions. There are reported sightings every few months. Someone who looks like him at a coffee shop in Portland, a man matching his description at a hiking trail in Colorado, a tech worker in Austin who bears a resemblance. None of these sightings have been verified, but they keep hope alive for those who want to believe. Others think the answer is simpler and darker, that Marcus, overwhelmed by guilt and fear, walked into those mountains with no intention of coming back, that he found a remote spot, far from any trail, and made a choice that his family will never be able to understand. The note in his journal, "Maybe this is how it ends," supports this theory, though it's far from conclusive. And then there are those who believe that something happened in those mountains that no one has been able to piece together, that there was someone else involved, someone who hasn't been identified, someone who knows the truth but has chosen to remain silent. The unidentified fingerprints in Marcus's car, the blood in the backpack, the strange timing of events, all of these suggest possibilities that the investigation hasn't fully explored. Natalie has her own theory, one that's evolved over the months of searching and investigating. I think Marcus went up there planning to disappear, she said recently, sitting in his apartment surrounded by the remnants of his life. I think David's confrontation was the final straw, the thing that made him realize he couldn't face what was coming. But I don't think he went there to die. I think he went there to hide, to figure out what to do next. And I think something went wrong. Maybe he got lost. Maybe he got hurt. Maybe he encountered someone else in those mountains, someone we don't know about. But I don't believe he just gave up. That wasn't who Marcus was. She paused, looking at a photo of her brother on the wall, a picture from happier times, before Sentinel AI, before the pressure and the compromises and the fear. The hardest part is not knowing, not being able to say goodbye, not being able to tell him that I forgive him for whatever mistakes he made, that I love him no matter what. He's out there somewhere, or he was, and I'll never stop looking until I find him. The case has raised broader questions about the tech industry and the pressures it places on founders. Mental health advocates have pointed to Marcus's story as an example of how the culture of Silicon Valley, the emphasis on growth at all costs, the celebration of risk-taking, the stigma around failure, can push people to breaking points. Several organizations have used the case to advocate for better support systems for entrepreneurs, for more honest conversations about the ethical dilemmas of technology, for recognition that behind every startup success or failure is a human being with limits and vulnerabilities. David Zhao's sister, Jennifer, has also spoken about the case, focusing on her brother's mental health struggles. David became obsessed with exposing corporate wrongdoing to the point where it consumed his entire life, she said. He lost his job, his relationships, his sense of perspective. He convinced himself that he was fighting for justice, but really he was spiraling. I wish I'd been able to help him before he did something that can't be undone, and I wish Marcus Valera's family could have the closure they deserve. The Tesla that Marcus drove into the mountains has been released from evidence and sold at auction. The proceeds went to paying off some of Sentinel AI's remaining debts. The clearing where it was found is unmarked, unremarkable. Just another spot in the vast wilderness of the Santa Cruz Mountains. But for those who know the story, it's become a kind of memorial, a place where people occasionally leave flowers or notes, tributes to a man who vanished without a trace. As for the truth of what happened that night, the full truth, the complete story, it remains elusive. The evidence suggests a man under extreme pressure, confronted by his mistakes, who made a series of decisions that led him into the darkness. But the gaps in the timeline, the unanswered questions, the missing pieces of the puzzle, all leave room for doubt, for speculation, for hope. Maybe someday a hiker will stumble upon something in those mountains, a clue, a sign, an answer. Maybe David Zhao will remember a detail he's forgotten, or come forward with information he's been holding back. Maybe Marcus himself will emerge from wherever he's been with a story that explains everything. Or maybe the mountains will keep their secret forever, and Marcus Valera will remain one of those mysteries that haunts the people who knew him, a reminder that even in our connected, surveilled, data-driven world, it's still possible for someone to simply disappear. Natalie continues to search. The police continue to investigate. And somewhere in the Santa Cruz Mountains, in the fog and the redwoods and the endless wilderness, the answer waits to be found. If you've been following this story, if you've been moved by Marcus's disappearance and the questions it raises, I want to thank you for listening. Cases like this remind us how fragile life can be, how quickly everything can change, and how important it is to hold on to the people we love. If this story has resonated with you, please take a moment to subscribe, to share your thoughts in the comments, and to remember that behind every headline is a family still searching for answers. Thank you for being here and for caring about stories that matter.